The generator chamber had ceased to belong to Naboo. It no longer answered to the architects who had hidden beauty beneath the palace and discipline beneath beauty. It belonged to heat and roar and iron-throated echo, to the black pit that split the chamber open from rail to rail like a wound, and to the three figures who had given that wound a meaning no engineer could have imagined. Of them, only one remained untouched by hope. Darth Maul stood balanced on the narrow gantry, as if he had been carved for such places. Sweat ran across the red and black planes of his face and caught in the sharp lines of old tattoos. Smoke dragged itself through the air in slow ribbons, silvered by furnace light. One end of his saber hissed near the floor. The other made a red half-circle over his shoulder and threw blood-colored reflections across the burnished metal around him. A body lay near the wall behind him, long-limbed and still, one hand curled toward a weapon already gone dark. Kwai Gon Jinn's chest rose once shallow as a whisper. Then even that effort seemed too much for flesh. Below the level of the gantry, in the open throat of the shaft, Obi-Wan Kenobi clung to a lip of metal with both hands. He had fallen too far to live and not far enough to die. His face, turned upward through the heat shimmer, was stripped bare of every discipline his order had ever taught him. What looked back at Maul was not calculation. It was grief made young, grief made bright, grief that still believed a clean leap could reverse the shape of the world. Maul saw it in the tightening of the shoulders first. Not the movement itself, but the intention that came before it. Sidious had taught him to watch the body only after the eyes. The body lied more slowly. For a suspended instant, there was no sound but the churn of generators and the distant crackle of failing circuits. Then, Obi-Wan moved. He came upward in a single violent surge, pulling with both arms, hurling the weight of himself toward the ledge, snatching at the fallen weapon of his master as if grief could make speed into destiny. Maul pivoted. The lower blade snapped down, and the upper blade came across in the same motion, one denying the boy the ledge, the other claiming the space above it. Red light split the air. Obi-Wan's body arched in that impossible fraction between surprise and pain, the expression on his face not yet horror, not yet understanding, merely the stunned vacancy of a promise broken before it could even be spoken. The blade crossed his chest and bit through cloth, flesh, bone, the breath in him. His fingers found the ledge and failed to close. The lightsaber he had almost seized struck the gantry, spun once, and vanished into the pit with a dwindling trail of blue. Obi-Wan hit the metal hard. His head turned slightly at impact, his hair falling over one eye, and for a heartbeat his body made one last involuntary effort toward life. Then, it did not move again. The chamber shrank around the silence that followed. Maul extinguished one end of his weapon and stood listening. His own breath was even. The blood pounding at his temples sounded to him like ritual drums from another life. A life so early it had lost all shape except hunger and training and the pain by which one had been fused to the other. Victory should have filled him. He had been sent against Jedi and had killed them both. The blade had not failed him. His master's will had taken form in muscle and timing and hate, and in the center of a royal power station that will had prevailed. Yet something in the Force had changed. It came not from the chamber but from far above, beyond the palace, beyond even the city. A flare. Reckless. Brilliant. Small and impossible. For one disorienting second, Maul felt the image of a child's fierce joy and the wild blind luck that so often masqueraded as providence. Then the feeling vanished beneath a concussion that rolled through the structure with enough force to make the gantry tremble. Somewhere high in the Naboo sky, something enormous was dying. The red blade in his hand hummed softly. Maul turned his head toward the sound of alarms shifting pitch. Not battle alarms now. Emergency cascade. Systems talking to one another in the mechanical language of sudden loss. Through layers of stone and conduit and palace above them, he heard another change a moment later. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. Thousands of droids linked to a single command signal had fallen quiet together. The battle outside had turned. Maul stepped over Obi-Wan's body and went to the dying master. Kwai Gon's eyes were half open. The older man had the look of someone listening to something very far away, as if the room itself had already become less real to him than a current no one else could feel. Blood soaked the front of his tunic in a dark, glossy spread. Maul crouched, expressionless, and studied him. Kwai Gon's lips moved. At first, Maul thought the man was only breathing out his last. Then, with extraordinary effort, the Jedi formed a word. Anakin Dorsh. The name meant nothing and did not mean nothing. Maul had heard of the slave boy from Tatooine only in fragments. Curiosity from the master, impatience from the apprentice, a nuisance attached to prophecy talk he had been taught to despise. Yet here, with life leaving him in the dark already filling the edges of his sight, this Jedi used his final strength not to curse his killer, not to warn his order, but to give breath to a child's name. Maul watched the light recede from his eyes. No triumph came, only information. He rose in a single fluid motion and drove the end of his saber through a surveillance node mounted high near the wall. Crystalline circuitry burst in a shower of white sparks. A second node died a heartbeat later. He turned, found Obi-Wan's comlink clipped at the dead man's belt, and tore it free. It pulsed once against his palm, waiting for a voice that would never answer. Above the chamber, human footsteps began to multiply. Distant yet urgent. Not droids, not the measured stamp of battle machines. Living men running because they believed they had won. Maul looked toward the corridor that led back into the palace proper. He could still pursue the queen. Still cut his way upward through the gathering confusion. Still turn public victory into private massacre. But he was not an animal loose to gorge itself on opportunity. He was a weapon survived by knowing when the hand that held it required blood, and when it required shadow. His master had not trained him to die for spectacle. The comlink vanished into a compartment at his wrist. Maul lowered himself to one knee, reached with the force, and unsealed a maintenance hatch beneath the gantry rail. Heat gusted upward. Below was a narrower world of service ladders, conduits, inspection ducts, and forgotten space, the underskeleton of the grand city above. Naboo had built elegance on top of engines. Like every civilized world, it had buried its ugliness beneath its graces. Maul slipped down into that buried ugliness and let the hatch settle into place above his horns with a whisper of metal against metal. Beneath the gantry ran a ladder slick with condensation and heat. He descended 3 rungs, then pushed off, dropping to the next platform with effortless control. The air grew tighter there, saturated with mineral steam and ionized copper. He moved through it as if he had been born to tunnels, because in a way he had. Not these tunnels, not these polished Naboo mechanisms dressed in gold and ceremony, but the deeper kind, the kind built inside fear, discipline, and silence. Above him, the first voices burst into the chamber. He heard boots striking railings, the sudden stop in their motion when the men saw the bodies, and then the startled human break in breathing that came before anyone could manage words. One voice, cracked open by disbelief, called for a Jedi who would never answer. Another swore. Another began issuing orders too loudly, as if volume could force order onto death. Maul did not look back. He turned left into an inspection crawl no wider than his shoulders, and shut off his saber. Darkness swallowed him at once. But darkness had never been emptiness to him. It had edges, currents, temperatures, the promise of cover. The shape of walls announced itself in the minute pressure of air against skin. The vibration of generators traveled through his palms whenever he touched metal. Somewhere above and ahead, the city of Theed had begun to discover that victory had a cost it had not expected to pay. He moved deeper, letting the palace map itself through him. Naboo's engineers had designed for elegance, maintenance, and plausible permanence. Their ducts curved cleanly. Their ladder wells were too broad at intersections. Their emergency conduits branched in 4s, not 3s. Already Maul could feel how such design could be used against the people who trusted it. The planet worshipped smooth surfaces. Smooth surfaces hid seams. He reached a junction chamber hung with coils of insulated cable and paused. The comlink at his wrist vibrated again. He drew it out and watched the dead Jedi's device cast a small green glow across his fingers. Someone was hailing Obi-Wan through static and urgency. Maul listened without answering. A clipped security voice. Another one layered over it. A woman briefly, low and composed, asking for confirmation. Then a man he did not know saying the Queen was on her way. He switched the channel off. Not destroyed, merely silenced. A dead man's tool could still serve the living. The chamber around him shuddered as failsafes locked into place. Somewhere, turbines wound down. Somewhere else, reserve systems came online with a rising throb. Theed was trying to become a city again after having been a battlefield. Maul crouched in the half-dark and let the facts arrange themselves. The Federation army had failed. The Queen lived. The Jedi were dead. His own survival was, for the moment, useful only if unseen. That calculation should have settled him. It did not. Beneath discipline there was the first hard nod of something he did not dignify with a name. Not fear. Not regret. Nothing so soft. It was the irritation of a blade that had cut cleanly and then been ordered back into the sheath before the blood on it had even cooled. He had won the duel. Yet above him, others would gather the shape of victory for themselves. A child in a starfighter. A queen on her throne. A senator with his hands folded in public grief. Maul resumed his descent. He passed through a valve chamber, through a disused service corridor lined in blackened pipes, through a circular maintenance hub where old water still collected in a rust-colored basin. The deeper he went, the older the construction became. Naboo's sleek refinements gave way to thicker stone, older metal, and architecture from earlier reigns that had never been removed, merely built over. The city revealed its past by degrees as it swallowed him. Here the walls were rough-cut. Here the floors sloped. Here the sound of generators gave way to the slower echo of underground water moving through ancient channels beneath the palace foundations. At last he reached a narrow platform overlooking one such channel. Water the color of deep glass coursed below, carrying reflected strips of failing emergency light along its surface like broken banners. Across the gap a vault door stood half open, perhaps abandoned by engineers decades ago when newer systems had made these levels unnecessary. Maul crossed the platform in silence, slipped through, and found a chamber no larger than a prison cell, fitted once for storage, and now empty but for a cracked console and a row of dead lamps. He stood in the middle of the small dark room and listened one final time to the city above. Shouts. Bells. Bells. The beginning of celebration, raw and uncertain, already cut through by morning. Naboo was reclaiming itself. It had no idea what still breathed beneath its feet. Maul closed the door behind him. Above him, the victorious began to count their dead. Below, the victor vanished. Victory came to the throne room without grace. One moment the Trade Federation guards were still moving in stiff ranks around the dais, blasters raised, optical sensors glowing with the impersonal obedience of machines. The next they stopped where they stood, every head turning a fraction toward nothing, every weapon lowering not by choice but by the sudden disappearance of the will that linked them. Some remained upright. Others collapsed in clattering heaps of durasteel on marble. One battle droid pitched forward against a pillar and slid slowly down it, leaving a black scrape across polished stone like an inelegant signature at the end of a brutal occupation. Padme Amidala kept her blaster aimed at Newt Gunray for a full second after the room went quiet. The Viceroy stared at the inert line of his own army, with all the wide, damp shock of a creature that had been protected by machinery for too long, and was only now learning what mortality felt like. Around him, handmaidens in borrowed uniforms and Naboo guards in scorched ceremonial blue held their positions until Captain Quarsh Panaka, one sleeve ripped open and one cheek marked by powder burns, gave the order to disarm the Nemoidians and secure the room. Only then did Padme lower her weapon. The throne room smelled of smoke, coolant and fear. Broken glass lay glittering across the floor beneath windows that had looked out over her city all her life. She had fought in these halls as a child with wooden rods and stern tutors, rehearsing posture and diplomacy beneath the same carved ceilings. She had never imagined the first time she reclaimed them as queen would be with a blaster in hand and dead machines at her feet. "Your Majesty," Panaka said, breathing hard but keeping his voice level. "The droids outside are dropping too. Reports from the plaza say the city is ours." Ours. The word should have opened relief inside her. Instead, she found only a kind of stunned stillness. It was the stillness of a person who had leaned her whole body against catastrophe for so long that when the weight finally shifted away, she did not know how to stand without it. "The Jedi," she said. Panaka's eyes flicked once toward the corridor leading down into the underlevels. The movement was tiny. It told her enough. "We've had no word yet." Padme did not answer. Behind her, C.O. Bibble had already begun issuing orders to palace staff who emerged from hiding in 2s and 3s, faces pale, clothes creased from long hours in storage alcoves and panic rooms. Somewhere beyond the throne room came the first peal of bells from the city, hesitant at first, then joined by others until the sound traveled through the palace like rain across glass. Celebration. Liberation. Confirmation that Naboo still existed. It met the look in Panaka's face and died before it could reach her. In the main hangar, on the opposite side of the palace complex, a yellow starfighter scraped down to the deck on smoking landing struts and skidded sideways in a shower of sparks. Ground crews scattered, then rushed back in with the irrepressible courage of people who had grown tired of living in fear. The cockpit popped open. A small figure climbed out, helmet too large, face blackened with soot and triumph. Anakin Skywalker grinned for almost 3 full breaths before he understood that the adults staring at him were not cheering in the simple way he had expected. Some of them did cheer, because he was a child and children deserved cheering when they came back alive from impossible things. A mechanic actually laughed and caught him by the shoulders before thinking better of it. But the laughter faltered when Panaka's security detail came running through the hangar and did not look at the boy first. They looked past him, toward the inner lifts. "Did you destroy the control ship?" one of the pilots asked. "I think so," Anakin said, still trying to keep up with the speed at which the day had changed around him. "It blew up. I mean, there were droids, and then there weren't." He looked from one face to another. "Did we win?" No one answered at once. The palace had begun to fill with motion again. Medics, guards, servants, diplomats emerging from hidden chambers, all of them carrying the brittle energy of people rescued too abruptly to understand rescue. Above, the bells continued. Below, a search team hurried into the lift shafts. Anakin watched them go and felt, without knowing why, a cold line draw itself down his spine. Padme arrived in the hangar as the boy climbed down from the wing of the starfighter. For a moment, her face changed. The queen vanished, replaced by the very young girl she still was, astonished into something close to joy. "You did it," she said. Anakin beamed because she had said it, because the impossible had happened, and she had seen him standing there after it. "I told you I was a pilot. You told all of us many things." Her smile came and went quickly, dimmed by the thought she could not leave behind. "Come with me." He heard the change in her voice and followed without protest. Panaka joined them at the corridor mouth, gave the boy a quick, unreadable look, and signaled to 2 guards. Together, they moved into the lower levels, where the palace turned from marble brilliance to metal, stone, and the more functional beauty of a place designed to keep a city alive. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became. The bells above faded. What replaced them was the hum of emergency systems and the soft, metallic ticking of cooling machinery. The search team had already found the chamber. That much was clear from the cluster of soldiers outside the shattered doors and the terrible hush that had fallen over professionals trained to keep speaking when they were afraid. Panaka pushed through first. Padme followed. Anakin slipped in behind her before anyone could stop him. The sight inside the chamber arranged itself in stages. Kwai Gon by the wall, robes dark with blood. Obi-Wan on the gantry where he had fallen, one arm flung out, fingers empty. Scorched marks where surveillance nodes had been destroyed. A maintenance hatch not quite flush with the floor. No sign of the red-bladed killer. Padme stopped so suddenly Anakin nearly collided with her. One of the guards bowed his head. Another crossed to the second body with the cautious reverent soldiers reserved for the dead who had seemed invincible an hour earlier. Panika took in the whole room at once. Every detail, every absence, every mechanical clue the assassin had left behind or taken with him. His jaw set. "He's gone," he said. The words did not feel adequate to the chamber. Gone was what one said about storms moving over the lake, not about a creature who had cut down Jedi in the heart of the palace and vanished into the foundations of the city. Padme stepped toward Kwai Gon and knelt. She did not touch the wound. She touched only the edge of his sleeve, as if the fabric itself deserved honor. This man had come to her world as a stranger. He had crossed blockades and law and danger for people he did not owe. He had spoken to her with a kind of grave patience that made her feel, for an instant at a time, less like a symbol and more like a person allowed to be young. Now he was dead in a room made ugly by the manner of it, and Naboo's victory would forever carry his absence inside it. When she rose and turned, Anakin was staring at Obi-Wan. He had not known the apprentice well. Obi-Wan had been wary of him, impatient sometimes, suspicious in the brisk and practical way adults could be suspicious of a child who complicated plans. But he had been there. Another figure in the strange new world that had opened after Tatooine. Another promise that the universe beyond the desert had rules and guardians, and a place somewhere within it for someone brave enough to matter. Now the young Jedi's face was pale and still, and all the force and motion that had lived in him were simply gone. Anakin swallowed. But we won. No one rebuked him for saying it. That made it worse. Padme turned fully then and crossed to him, taking off the gloves she had worn during the assault, because the gesture felt too official for the look on his face. She rested one hand on his shoulder. Through the leather of his borrowed flight suit she could feel how hard he was trembling. "Yes," she said softly. "We did." He looked up at her with confusion sharpened into hurt. "Then why does it feel like this?" She had no answer fit for a child, and no time to find one fit for a queen. So she gave him the only honesty available. Because sometimes winning is not the same as being spared. Panaka moved to the damaged hatch and crouched. One of the guards reported finding heat traces below, but no immediate route through the lower shaft without equipment. Another said one comlink was missing from the bodies. Panaka stood. "Seal this level," he ordered. "No one down here without my clearance. Triple the security around all substructure access points. I want engineering maps. Old ones too. If he's in the palace, he's not staying on this level." "Nay." Padma heard the strain beneath his composure. Panaka had fought occupiers in political battles, and the daily indignity of seeing his queen treated like a bargaining piece. A hidden killer in the bones of the palace offended something almost personal in him. Naboo could endure armies at its gates. It did not endure filth beneath the floors. The bells above continued, but now they sounded remote and wrong. Anakin looked again at Kwai Gon. He had the dazed expression of a child who has been told a door is open, and then watched it disappear into stone. "He said he was going to train me." Padme closed her eyes for one heartbeat. When she opened them, she saw not only a grieving boy, but the future complication of him, the weight he might become to institutions already shuddering from the return of a dark thing the Republic had believed itself beyond. None of that mattered yet. What mattered was that a promise had died in this room and the child bound to it had been made to see the body. "Come," she said. This time he resisted. Nah, physically. He simply stood fixed to the spot, staring as though staring hard enough might pull breath back into the dead. Panaka gave the slightest nod to one of his men, but Padme lifted a hand. She stepped beside Anakin and waited. Not as queen, not as ruler, just as another young person forced too early to look at what war required. At last he moved. When they left the chamber, Panaka remained behind with his guards and the dead. Padme heard him already questioning engineers, already demanding schematic overlays, already beginning the hunt. Anakin walked beside her in silence, helmet hanging from one hand. The victory bells kept ringing through Theed. People in the streets would be embracing. Gungans in the plains would be shouting to the sky. Ministers would be composing statements. Prisoners would be counted. Treaties imagined. Banners raised. Under all of it, Naboo had acquired a ghost. Night took Theed slowly. Even after the fighting ended, the city did not trust darkness enough to surrender to it. Lamps blazed in every high window of the palace. Patrol craft moved along the canals. Emergency crews worked beneath banners hastily hung in the colors of liberation, and every time one bell stopped, another took up the sound, as if the people feared silence might invite the invaders back. The city wore victory like a borrowed cloak, grateful for it, unwilling to take it off, not yet certain it belonged. Far below that trembling confidence, Maul sat on the floor of the storage vault and cut a strip from the inside lining of his own outer robe. His wounds were not mortal. The Jedi had marked him only in passing, a glancing burn high along his side where Obi-Wan's blade had kissed and not bitten, a deeper gouge at the shoulder from Kwai Gon's final offensive burst. Neither would slow him once treated. Pain was weather. He had been schooled not to resent weather. He cleaned the burns with water siphoned from an ancient maintenance tap, cauterized one reopened line with the briefest touch of his saber, and bound both injuries with practical economy. He wasted no motion. He had never been allowed the luxury of dramatizing hurt. When the work was done, he sat back against the wall and closed his eyes. Darkness did not soothe him. It clarified. He let his breathing settle into the pattern Sidious had driven into him over years of punishment and refinement. Slow enough to lower the pulse, hard enough to keep the mind sharpened rather than softened. The Force moved differently beneath the palace than it had in the chamber above. There it had boiled around combat and sudden death, full of sparks and fracture. Here it ran in colder lines. Stone remembered. Water carried impressions. The city itself was a machine made by a people who believed harmony could be engineered. Beneath that belief, Maul felt the same things he had always found anywhere living beings built power. Fear of loss, vanity disguised as order, tenderness they mistook for virtue, pride they mistook for peace. He had been taught to despise such worlds. Yet in the stillness beneath Naboo, he found his thoughts returning, not to the dead Jedi, but to the flare he had felt in the sky and the name spoken with a dying breath. Anakin? He opened his eyes. The cracked console in the corner of the vault blinked once as an encrypted signal reached it through circuits no palace technician knew were active. Maul crossed to it, keyed in a sequence with bloodless precision, and watched blue light bloom into the narrow room. Sidious appeared at half scale above the console, hooded, hollowed by distortion, the face within shadowed as if the machinery itself feared to illuminate it fully. Even in miniature, the presence altered the room. Maul bowed his head at once, not because posture mattered to the master, but because the years of obedience lived in muscle as surely as they lived in doctrine. "My master." Sidious said nothing for a moment. His gaze moved once over Maul's bindings, over the damp stone, over the miserable efficiency of the hiding place. Outside the vault, underground water whispered through ancient channels. Somewhere above, a woman laughed too loudly in relief, and then covered her mouth. Every sound of the living world seemed faint and foolish beside that silence. "You survived," Sidious said at last. "I completed the task." A long pause followed. Approval from Sidious was never a warm thing. It was a blade tested against a thumb, the brief recognition that the edge remained true. The Jedi Master is dead. Yes. The apprentice, dead. Sidious inclined his head a fraction. "And yet you are not where I sent you to be." Maul did not move. The battle above turned unexpectedly. The battle above turned because all battles turn for those who do not understand what battle is for. There was no anger in Sidious's voice. Anger would have suggested disorder. What Maul heard instead was cold correction, the ruler laid against a line to see whether it remained straight. Listen carefully. The Federation's defeat does not threaten me. Public grief will serve where public outrage served before. The Queen's survival is useful. The Senate's fear is useful. My elevation proceeds. Oh yeah. Then why? Maul almost asked. Had he been sent at all? But the question died before it reached his tongue. Maul knew the answer. The duel had not been only about killing Jedi. It had been about revelation, pressure, and the beginning of a larger terror. The Republic would look at Naboo and see the return of an enemy it had forgotten how to name. That alone was power. What are your orders? He asked. You remain on Naboo. The words struck harder than any blow from the day's fighting. In the blue light of the hologram, nothing in Maul's expression changed. Years of discipline held, but inside him something tightened with metallic force. Remained. Buried. Unseen while celebrations rose over the bones of his victory. A lesser being would have mistaken the sensation for humiliation. Maul knew better. It was the first true pressure of a chain. Sidious went on. You will not be seen. You will not engage the Queen. You will not attempt the Jedi who arrive unless concealment fails. You will erase every trace of Federation dealings that touches my interests. Financial records, restricted channels, unauthorized access routes, any surviving witnesses whose knowledge extends beyond their station. Naboo is to be restored in appearance and poisoned in secret. None. Maul listened. There is also the boy. The storage vault seemed to contract by one invisible degree. Maul said nothing. The slave from Tatooine is now in the company of Naboo's court and will soon be brought before the Order again. You will not approach him. You will not test him. You will not kill him unless I command it. The silence after that was not empty. It had texture. Maul could feel the shape of his master's interest in the absence of explanation. Sidious rarely protected anything he did not mean to use. He matters, Maul said. Sidious's smile was almost too slight to be called one. Everything matters to someone. Learn to distinguish between what matters for a day and what matters for an age. The hologram flickered as encrypted traffic moved across the palace grid overhead. A public message, perhaps? Condolences. Gratitude. Another mask being fitted into place over the face only Maul was allowed to know in full. You will receive coordinates, Sidious said. There are old underways beneath the palace and lake country that the current engineers no longer service. Make them yours. I will need routes no government account contains. I will need secrets kept where even Naboo's own security cannot find them. You have done well. Do not ruin it by desiring applause. The transmission ended. Blue light vanished. The room became merely small again, merely damp and mean. Maul remained standing in the dark. He desired no applause. Sidious knew that. The rebuke had been chosen for another purpose. Not to correct a hunger Maul possessed, but to remind him which hungers his master attributed to lesser beings. Useful beings. Replaceable beings. Maul turned off the console and let the last warmth leave it beneath his palm. Above, in the palace guest wing, Padme sat beside the bed where Anakin lay awake and pretended not to. The room had once been designed for visiting dignitaries who required soft fabrics, controlled temperature, and the illusion that Naboo's hospitality could cradle them better than their own homes. Tonight it held only exhaustion. The curtains had been drawn against the lights of the city. A lamp burned low on the side table. Anakin had changed out of his flight gear, but the day still clung to him in streaks of soot along the hairline, and a bruise darkening his forearm from where the cockpit harness had locked too hard during descent. Padme had meant only to see whether he slept. Instead, she found him staring at the ceiling with the unwavering intensity of a child who has discovered that if he closes his eyes, what waits behind them is worse. You should rest, she said. He turned his head toward her. I tried. She sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed, rather than the mattress itself. There were lines she understood instinctively even when no one had taught them to her. Propriety. Distance. the private territories of the grieving. Yet the room was quiet enough to invite honesty, and she suspected both of them were too tired to maintain anything else. "When I was little," she said, "my tutors used to say sleep was the body's way of making peace with the day." Did it work? Not on difficult days. Anakin looked back at the ceiling. Kwai Gon said things like that. His voice was thin but not childish in the ordinary way. It had been stretched by too much happening too quickly. He said you have to feel things and still do what's right. Padme folded her hands in her lap. That sounds like him. He promised. The words came flatly now, without self-pity. He said he would train me. Obi-Wan didn't want to, but he was going to anyway. He blinked once and kept looking upward. Do promises still count if the person dies? Padme thought of treaties, oaths, coronation vows spoken by girls who had not yet finished growing into their bones. She thought of how often institutions kept the shape of a promise while draining the living mercy out of it. She thought of the two dead Jedi below the palace and the boy beside her, whose whole future had been tied in his mind to the voice of one of them. "I think," she said carefully, "that promises change hands." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the dead leave work behind them." She looked toward the curtained window, toward the city she had almost lost. Sometimes someone else chooses to carry it. Sometimes no one does. But the promise is still there, asking. He was quiet a long time. "Do you think they'll send me back?" Padme turned to him. Of all the fears in the room, that one seemed to her the youngest and the cruelest. "Back to Tatooine?" He nodded. Home, and not home. Mother, and slavery still coiled around every road. A planet he had longed to leave and could not bear to leave completely because part of him remained there in the shape of her. "I don't know," she said. "But you will not be forgotten. Naboo will not allow that." "No. He gave a tiny, humorless breath that was not quite a laugh. "That's not the same." No, she thought. It wasn't. Public gratitude was a thin shelter for private loss. Still, she reached out and laid her hand briefly over his. "No," she said. "It isn't." After she left, Anakin kept staring into the dark until the room around him dissolved into another darkness entirely. A shaft, a red blade, eyes like burning metal and no human pity in them at all. He jerked awake before sleep had fully claimed him and sat upright with his heart hammering. Far below, in the first chamber he had marked as his own, Maul opened Obi-Wan's comlink again and listened to the dead man being called. By dawn, the palace had maps spread across 3 tables. Old blueprints, engineering revisions, maintenance overlays from different reigns, hand-annotated utility routes from before the current administration. Emergency diagrams recovered from archives that still smelled faintly of dust and lake damp. Panaka stood above them all with a mug of untouched caf cooling by his hand, and the look of a man insulted by architecture. Naboo's beauty had always pleased him in public, because it pleased the people he served. In private, he preferred clarity. Lock this corridor. Guard that lift. Secure the perimeter. The knowledge that an assassin could be moving through forgotten sublevels, while citizens rang bells in the streets, offended his entire understanding of the world. "He has to surface somewhere," one engineer insisted. Panaka did not look up. "Then let's make sure he surfaces into rifles." The engineer swallowed and said no more. They found the first body 2 levels below the generator chamber. Not a guard. A palace technician. Young, perhaps 20. Assigned overnight to inspect coolant relays that had overloaded when the droid army shut down. He had no defensive wounds, and almost no expression left on his face. Only the blank slackness of someone whose life had been interrupted before fear could fully register. The wound that killed him was precise, delivered so fast and cleanly that even Panaka, who had seen his share of battlefield death, felt a chill under the skin. "He heard something," one of the guards muttered. "Went looking. Then he died for curiosity," Panaka said. "No one goes alone from now on." The hunt widened. Teams moved into the Underworks in rotating shifts. Naboo guards with compact rifles and shock lamps took the main service corridors. Gungan scouts, better suited than any of them to water channels and low-visibility terrain, mapped submerged branches of the substructure from access points beyond the palace walls. Portable sensors were dragged down old stairs. Blast doors were reactivated. For a full day and half another night, Theed lived in two moods at once: liberated in the sunlight, hunted beneath it. Anakin learned all of this because adults forgot children heard everything when their faces were solemn enough. He was not supposed to leave the upper guest levels without escort. That instruction lasted until the first time he heard Panika mention the missing comlink. One of the security officers had triangulated the signal twice in 6 hours. Not enough to trap the assassin, but enough to know the device was moving. Obi-Wan's comlink, carried by the thing that had killed him. The knowledge struck Anakin with a logic only grief could make reasonable. If the man below had taken something from Obi-Wan, then following it was not only dangerous, it was necessary. Children did not often distinguish between those two categories. He slipped out during a shift change by going the way he always went through systems. Not by the door adults watched, but through the space no one imagined mattered. A service hatch behind a decorative wall panel led to a narrow maintenance corridor used by cleaning droids too small to warrant guard attention. The panel had faulty wiring. Anakin had noticed it on the first day because machines spoke to him in the language of little mistakes. 10 minutes later, he was 2 levels below where any responsible person believed him to be, creeping along the outer lip of a decommissioned turbine hall with the carelessness peculiar to the gifted. Below him, Panaka's search team moved between pillars with lamps held low. The hall had once been beautiful in the way all Naboo utility spaces tried to be beautiful. Marble reliefs of river gods still watched from the walls, though condensation had blurred their faces and mineral deposits had crusted their outstretched hands. A narrow canal ran down the center of the chamber, carrying warm runoff beneath grates cut in the likeness of reeds and fish. Steam drifted upward in intermittent breaths. Red emergency strips lit the space from below, leaving the upper arches in shadow. Anakin crouched behind a column and listened. "Signals ahead," one guard whispered. Panaka lifted 2 fingers. "Stop. Spread. Wait. Wait." He was good, Anakin thought in the abstract. The way boys think when danger still feels partly like story. Panaka moved like someone made of corners. Efficient, angular, impossible to misread. The men around him trusted him because he never asked their fear to be smaller than it was. From somewhere deeper in the hall came the faint static chirp of a comlink reconnecting to a weak repeater node. Obi-Wan's. Panaka heard it too. He motioned left. Anakin should have stayed where he was. He knew that in a distant, well-behaved part of himself. But the sound had reached him like a hooked wire. He edged along the column, then across a narrow maintenance beam no wider than his boot length, using one hand against damp stone for balance. The hall opened beneath him in broken geometry. Steam rose and parted. For a blink he saw only Panaka's men below and red reflections on water. Then something moved above them. Not fast. That was the worst of it. Fast would have been easier to understand. This was deliberate, almost leisurely, a dark shape unfolding from shadow along the upper grating with the confidence of a creature that had never in its life mistaken itself for prey. 2 horns caught a stripe of emergency red. A face turned. Eyes burned like coals banked under ash. Anakin froze so completely even his breath seemed to disappear. Maul had sensed the boy before seeing him. The child's presence in the Force was impossible to confuse with anyone else's. Bright, unstable, vast in a way that made ordinary comparison useless. He did not blaze like a trained Jedi. He flared like something unshaped and celestial, dangerous because it had not yet learned its own edges. Maul had felt him threading illegally through the maintenance spine long before the small body reached the overlook. He had adjusted his position accordingly. Now they looked at one another, through a veil of steam. The boy's fear came clean and sharp. Beneath it, Maul felt something else. Not only terror, recognition. as if the child had already seen this face in some half-formed interior place and had known, even before his mind could name it, that one day they would matter to each other. Maul could kill him in less than a heartbeat. One leap to the beam, one stroke. An inconvenience removed before prophecy or politics could gather around it. The thought arrived complete and practical. It left just as swiftly, checked not by mercy but by command. Sidious's order lived in him as surely as muscle memory. Do not touch the boy. Below, Panaka's team shifted toward the latest comlink ping. They had not yet seen the assassin overhead. Anakin made a sound then, tiny and involuntary. Something between a gasp and the beginning of a cry. Panaka snapped his head up. "Get down!" he shouted. Everything broke at once. Maul dropped not toward the boy but away from him, landing on an upper catwalk with a metal clang that sent echoes exploding through the chamber. His saber came alive in a red spear of light that turned steam to blood-colored mist. Guards below raised rifles and fired. Bolts struck grating stone, watered auto. One hit a pipe. The hall filled with scalding vapor. Panaka cursed and shoved a man aside just before Maul's blade took the rifle from his hands in two glowing pieces. The assassin did not stay to duel. That, more than anything, terrified Panaka. A swordsman who wanted battle could be drawn into battle. This one wanted only openings. He moved through the hall in discontinuous glimpses. Above a stairwell, gone. On a beam, gone. Red light cutting briefly across a guard's shoulder before vanishing into steam. One man screamed. Another went down without sound. Panaka fired twice at a horned silhouette and hit only stone. Somewhere overhead, Anakin was still clinging to the beam, eyes wide, unable to look away. "Skywalker!" Panaka roared when he saw him. Fury gave the child's name a shape it had never had before. "Move!" Anakin slid rather than climbed, half falling the last few feet into Panaka's reach. The captain caught him by the front of his tunic and hauled him behind a column just as a red blade carved through the air where the boy's head had been. Stone spat sparks into their faces. Panaka shoved Anakin toward the rear exit without taking his eyes off the steam. "Run!" The order snapped whatever paralysis remained. Anakin ran. He heard more than saw the next moments. Panaka shouting formations, boots slipping on wet metal, a rifle discharged too close, a man crying out with the high astonishment of the newly wounded. Then, after all of it, a silence so immediate it felt like another kind of trap. When Panaka finally advanced into the thinning steam with two men at his shoulders, the hall had emptied. Two guards were dead. One lay half in the runoff channel, water folding red around his sleeve. The other had fallen against the base of a marble saint whose carved expression remained serenely indifferent to violence. The comlink static had stopped. On the upper grating where the assassin had first appeared, Panaka found nothing but one scorched footprint and a thin blackened line where a blade had briefly touched metal. Anakin stood at the far doorway shaking so violently he could barely remain upright. Panaka crossed to him in 5 hard strides, seized him by both shoulders, and for one dangerous second looked very close to forgetting the boy was not a soldier. "What?" he said with terrible control. "Were you thinking?" Anakin tried to answer and could not. He had no language for the pull that had brought him down there, or for the certainty he had felt in that heartbeat of eye contact, that the man in the dark had known him somehow. He could only stare past Panaka to the blood and steam, and think that the day had not ended when the bells began. It had simply gone underground. Panaka let him go with visible effort. "You do not move without escort again. Do you understand me?" Anakin nodded. Panaka looked over his shoulder at the dead men, at the chamber of river gods and emergency light, and understood with unwanted clarity that Naboo's hidden war had just become real. Not rumor. Not precaution. Real. Above them, the city celebrated into the night. Below, the killer had learned the boy's face. Rain came to Theed on the 3rd morning after liberation. Not a summer storm sweeping theatrical light over the lake country, but a steady gray descent that flattened colors and deepened stone, turning banners heavy and palace steps slick. The city seemed to welcome it. Bells fell silent at last. Citizens who had exhausted themselves with relief moved more quietly through the streets. Smoke stains on facades darkened into the weather and looked less like fresh wounds than the beginning of memory. Padme stood at the top of the landing platform in black ceremonial dress, bareheaded despite the rain, and watched the Jedi shuttle lower through the clouds. Its engines hissed against the wet air. Palace guards formed ranks to either side. Panaka stood a half-step behind her, newly uniformed but no less exhausted. He had slept perhaps 2 hours since the battle. Rain gathered at the edge of his collar and ran down into the rigid line of his posture. He did not seem to notice. The shuttle settled. The hatch opened. Yoda descended first because no one who saw him would have thought to place him anywhere except at the head of such a procession, size notwithstanding. Small he was, yes, and stooped, and wrapped in a robe darkening under the rain. But the moment he stepped onto the platform, the space around him altered. Servants and guards who knew little of the order felt it instinctively and lowered their eyes. Behind him came Mace Windu in deep brown robes that made the rain seem somehow sharper around his stillness. If Yoda's presence resembled age-old roots finding stone, Mace's resembled a blade sheathed only because a hand stronger than violence held it there. Padme went forward to meet them. "Masters," she said. Yoda studied her face for a long heartbeat, reading perhaps the youth under the ceremony, the grief under the discipline. A hard victory this was. Yes. Mace inclined his head. "We came as soon as the council could move." Panaka almost spoke then and stopped himself. Padme heard what he did not say. Too late. Too late for the dead. Too late for the first men lost in the tunnels. Perhaps not too late for what remained. "The assassin is still here," she said. Rain struck the landing platform in 1,000 tiny clicks. Yoda's ears lowered by a fraction. Mace's gaze shifted to Panaka. "You're certain?" Panaka did not waste words. 2 Jedi dead. Surveillance cut. Substructure infiltration confirmed. 4 palace personnel and guards killed since the battle. We have signal traces from a stolen comlink and multiple eyewitness accounts, including the boy. Mace looked back to Padme. "Skywalker saw him. In the Underworks," she said. "Against orders." "His instincts remain poor," Panaka muttered. "His courage remains worse," Padme said, because irritation was easier to carry than fear. Yoda gave the faintest sound that might have been agreement or amusement or neither. "Take us below." They went first to the generator chamber. The room had been cleaned only enough to make reverence possible. Blood was gone from the floor, but not from memory. Scorch marks remained, as did the broken surveillance mounts and the subtle violence done to the air by death itself. The bodies had been prepared and moved to ceremonial holding. The absence of them made the chamber feel no less haunted. Mace knelt beside the maintenance hatch without touching it. His eyes traveled over the cut marks, the rail positions, the angles from which a fighter might have moved. He was not reading merely evidence. He was reading intention. "Efficient," he said quietly. "No wasted action, no revelry in the kill. Whoever this is, he was made for purpose." "Apprentice," Yoda murmured. Panaka looked at him. "You think he serves someone?" Yoda raised his face toward the chamber heights, toward the invisible palace above, and perhaps beyond even that. Rain muttered against distant stone. "Serves, yes. Alone, no." Mace stood. The return of one such enemy would already be grave. 2 means design. They inspected the hall where Panaka's men had died next. Yoda closed his eyes there and placed one small hand against damp marble. The old saint above him wept rainwater down a blank stone cheek. The runoff channel still carried faint pink where the engineers had not entirely succeeded in cleaning it. "Recent. The hate is," Yoda said. "Lingering it remains." Panaka kept his arms folded behind his back because it was the only posture that stopped his hands from becoming fists. "Can you find him?" Yoda opened his eyes. "Find a shadow in a world? Simple this is not. especially when a darker shadow falls from far away. Macy's glance flicked toward him at that, and Padme felt, not for the first time, that important conversations among the powerful often occurred in half-spoken fragments the rest of the galaxy was left to pay for. They questioned Anakin in one of the smaller audience chambers, because the council masters had no wish to interrogate a grieving child like a suspect. Even so, the room acquired the feel of judgment as soon as he entered it. Anakin's chin lifted instinctively. Padme, sitting near the window, recognized the posture. It belonged to the young, to the threatened, and to those who had learned early that adults often mistook nervousness for guilt. Yoda asked the first questions gently. What had he seen? Where? How long? Had the assassin spoken? Anakin answered with surprising clarity once he began. He described the horns, the eyes, the way the face had seemed to wait inside the steam instead of emerging from it. He described the red blade. He described something harder to explain. The sensation that the man had looked at him, not as a random obstacle but as though he already mattered. Mace listened without interruption. You felt him looking at you, he said at last. Anakin frowned, frustrated by how thin words became around certain experiences. It wasn't just looking. What was it? I don't know. He glanced toward Padme as if hoping she might translate him into adult language. Like he knew something, or like... He searched for it, then shook his head. Like when a machine makes a sound right before it breaks, and you know it means something bad, even if you can't explain the sound. Mace's expression did not soften, but something in it shifted from skepticism to attention. Yoda watched the boy a long time. Afraid, were you? Yes, Anakin said immediately. Still, down there you went. Anakin's mouth tightened. It was Obi-Wan's comlink. No one corrected him for saying Obi-Wan as though they had been close. Grief was allowed shortcuts. Mace turned away a fraction and looked out at the rain slicking the palace roofline. He's too impulsive. Padme bristled before she could stop herself. He's 9, which is not, in my experience, an age that improves impulsiveness. Nor is war. The room held still. Panika stared determinedly at the opposite wall. Anakin looked from one adult to another with mounting resentment. Yoda's eyes half closed, not in dismissal but in the peculiar concentration of someone listening to currents beneath speech. At war with himself, the boy already is, Yoda said. Left alone, that war grows. Mace faced him. And brought into the temple. Still may grow. That is not an answer. No? Yoda said softly. It is not. The tension broke not because anyone resolved it, but because a messenger entered to announce that preparations for the Jedi funeral rites were complete. 2 pyres had been raised on the memorial grounds beside the water. Naboo's court awaited the master's direction on the order of honor. Anakin's face changed at the word funeral. For a moment, the defiance vanished, and he was simply a child again. One who had lost the person whose promise had rearranged his whole sense of tomorrow. Padme wanted to spare him the ceremony. She knew at once that this would be impossible and, perhaps, wrong. As the chamber emptied, Mace lingered behind with Yoda near the rain-streaked window. If the apprentice lives, he said in a low voice, his master is already moving inside the Republic. Yoda's reflection in the glass looked older than any single body ought to contain. Yes. And the boy? The old master's gaze followed Anakin disappearing down the corridor between Panika and Padme, small and stiff-backed in borrowed black. Dangerous he is, Yoda said. So is what abandonment makes. High in the venting grid above the chamber, hidden behind intake slats darkened by years of dust and moisture, Maul heard enough to know the shape of the threat descending around him. He had followed the Jedi Masters since their landing without allowing himself the vanity of engaging them. Yoda's presence was like standing too near a deep and ancient tree while lightning moved through its roots. Mace was different, less old, more edged, a concentration of force so disciplined it became nearly opaque. Against either alone, victory would be uncertain. Against both, suicidal. Sidious had not needed to order restraint. Reality provided it. Still, as Maul withdrew through the vent shadows, he carried with him a fact more useful than any duel. The Order did not agree on the boy. Sidious would already have guessed as much. The funeral took place at sunset when Naboo's grief could be made to look almost ceremonial enough to bear. The memorial ground lay beyond the palace terraces where carved stone yielded at last to grass and water. 2 pyres had been raised side by side beneath tall trees, whose leaves moved only slightly in the evening air. The lake behind them caught the sky's last pale gold and turned it to trembling bronze. Court musicians stood silent. Nobles wore black veils and polished mourning masks at their belts according to old custom. Gungan leaders came draped in wet, gleaming fabrics from the marsh country, their enormous eyes solemn, their long hands folded. The newly freed people of Naboo lined the outer walkways in respectful quiet. At the center of it all, the bodies of Kwai Gon and Obi-Wan lay in ceremonial repose, wrapped and prepared according to Jedi rite with Naboo's own reverence woven carefully around it. The pairing of them struck everyone who saw it. Master and student, age and youth. The long patience of one life ended beside the sharp beginning of another. Together they made the victory look far more costly than any speech could have admitted. Padme stood nearest the pyres with Panaka to one side and Anakin on the other. The boy had insisted on standing, not sitting, and no one had argued with him. He wore black formal clothing cut quickly to fit him, the sleeves still a little too long, the collar too high at the throat. In the fading light he looked smaller than ever, but not because he was afraid. Grief had a way of making children resemble their actual age only in body. Everything else in him had been pulled taut toward something older. Palpatine arrived shortly before the rites began. He came not as the hooded secret the galaxy did not know, but as Naboo's newly elevated statesman, Chancellor-elect by the grace of crisis and Senate weakness. He wore somber cream and deep charcoal, the richness of the fabric muted by cut and color. Courtiers bowed. Ministers stepped aside. The people watching from beyond the formal grounds murmured with pride that their world had given the Republic its next leader in the same week it had nearly been broken by invaders. Palpatine accepted their looks with measured sorrow. When he paused beside Padme, his face held exactly the correct degree of shared grief and paternal admiration. "You have saved your people," he said softly enough for only those closest to hear. "The Republic will remember what courage looks like because of you." Padme inclined her head. She ought to have been warmed by the praise. Instead, she found herself noticing how easily his voice fit any occasion, how naturally it moved from condolence to statecraft without ever seeming to change shape. It was not suspicion, not yet. Only fatigue sharpened by too many deaths. Anakin looked up at Palpatine and saw kindness. Adults train themselves to detect layers. Children saw the surface first, and surfaces mattered. The rites began. A Jedi officiant from the arriving shuttle spoke the ancient words over both bodies, voice carrying cleanly across the water. Yoda and Mace stood with bowed heads, motionless as carved figures from some older, sterner tradition. When the torches were brought forward, the evening seemed to contract around the act. Fire touched the dry wood beneath the first pyre and moved quickly. Flames rose, elegant at first, then hungry. The second followed. Smoke climbed into the descending dusk and wound itself among the branches, turning gold, then gray. Anakin's breath caught once. He made no other sound. Padme felt the heat on her face and thought of the generator chamber below the palace, of how industrial heat had devoured these lives. In conflict and ceremonial fire now returned them to dignity. A civilization did that, she supposed. It made meaning afterward because meaning beforehand had proven impossible. Palpatine lowered his eyes at all the appropriate moments. Once, during a pause in the rite, he rested a hand briefly on Anakin's shoulder. The gesture was gentle enough to be admired and calculated enough to be unforgettable. The boy did not pull away. From the ridge beyond the reeds, hidden under a travel-dark cloak with the hood drawn low over his horns, Maul watched the pyres burn. Distance altered nothing. Even from the far side of water and ceremony, he could read the geometry of power assembled there. Yoda and Mace near the flames, guardians of old authority. The Queen straight-backed in mourning, her public legitimacy sharpened by suffering. The boy at her side, bright in the Force even through grief. And Palpatine among them all, moving by almost no movement at all, his influence a current no one else could see, because they were busy looking at hands, titles, faces, the small theater of ordinary politics. Maul did not feel remorse. Sith were not trained to hunger for absolution. Yet he experienced something harsher and less comfortable. Estrangement. He had cut down the Jedi. He had made this funeral possible. And still he stood outside it, unseen, while his master wore public sorrow like silk and received the gratitude of the world shaped by his own design. The fire cracked. Smoke drifted across the water and briefly obscured the figures on the central path. Through that shifting veil, Maul saw Anakin tilt his face toward the flames, eyes bright not only with tears, but with something gathering beneath them. Hurt too large to remain merely hurt. A wound seeking purpose. Maul had seen that transformation before in other forms. In prisoners. In acolytes. In himself. The rite ended in silence rather than applause. Naboo understood enough to know some occasions must not be answered with sound. People bowed their heads. Gungan leaders touched their palms to their chests. Palace servants began moving like ghosts around the edges to direct mourners away. Mace remained by the dying edge of the pyres with Yoda after most others had turned toward the palace. Their voices did not carry far, but Maul, who had spent years learning to separate signal from background, caught fragments when the wind shifted. Which was slain? Mace asked quietly. The master's servant, or the one who led him? Yoda watched the smoke twist into the darkening sky. Servant, I think, yet no less dangerous for that. Then the true war hasn't even shown its face. Yoda's expression did not change. Shown, it has. Understood, it has not. Palpatine escorted Padme partway back toward the terraces. Anakin walked a few paces behind them until Palpatine slowed to fall into step beside him. You honored them well, the Chancellor-elect said. Anakin did not answer right away. The Jedi don't even know if they want me. Palpatine's look, had anyone older and more suspicious studied it, might have seemed almost too compassionate. Great institutions are rarely swift to recognize what does not fit their expectations. You think they should? I think, Palpatine said gently, that your future should not be decided only by people who fear how unusual you are. The words struck somewhere deep and lodging. Anakin carried them in silence the rest of the walk. That night, after the palace dimmed and the memorial fires burned low behind wards and guards, Palpatine shed public grief like a ceremonial cloak. He went alone to an unused royal boathouse at the far edge of the lower gardens, a structure half concealed by ivy, and no longer part of any regular security sweep because its docks had silted up years ago. Rain earlier in the day had left the wood damp and the air smelling of wet reeds. He entered without light, closed the door, and waited. Maul emerged from the darkness at the rear wall as though the boards themselves had shaped him. For a moment they stood together in the unlit boathouse, master and apprentice, both wrapped in shadow, separated from the public world by a few thin planks and an infinite degree of truth. You watched, Sidious said. Yes. And your place among them is secure. The hood shifted slightly. Perhaps amusement, perhaps approval. For now, Maul's voice remained flat. The Order suspects 2 Sith. They should. They brought the boy before the Masters. Sidious turned fully then. The dark concealed his features, but not the sharpened attention behind them. What did you sense? Power, Maul said. Unformed, dangerous. Dangerous things are often the most useful. Maul held his silence. It was the only safe container for the question tightening through him. Sidious answered it anyway, because masters enjoyed reminding apprentices they had already understood what had not yet been spoken aloud. Do not mistake interest for replacement. The sentence landed harder precisely because it had not been requested. I do not, Maul said. Good. Sidious stepped closer, close enough that the boathouse seemed to darken further around the edges. Naboo is not finished. Beneath the palace and out into the old lake tunnels, there are routes dating back to dynasties even the current court barely remembers. You will map them. A restored world is the best hiding place in the galaxy. Everyone believes peace when gardens are replanted. And the boy? Sidious's hood angled slightly toward the palace lights far off through the slats. The boy will go to Corasont. The Order will hesitate. Hesitation is a corridor. I have walked many. Maul absorbed that. In battle, clarity had always come through direct opposition. One blade against another. But here, in the close rot of politics and prophecy, clarity wore subtler shapes. Sidious did not merely intend to use the child. He intended to cultivate the conditions under which the child would come to him, believing the choice was his own. "Stay hidden," Sidious said. "Kill only when necessary. Fear spreads better from uncertainty than from certainty. Let Naboo whisper of a phantom in its foundations. Let the Jedi chase echoes. By the time they understand the meaning of your survival, I will have made use of their confusion." He turned toward the door. "My master," Maul said. Sidious paused. "The Queen's captain comes close. So let him come close. Men who believe they are nearly successful work harder and think less." Then he was gone, leaving behind damp wood, the smell of reeds, and a silence that felt sharper than sound. Maul remained in the dark a long time after. Beyond the boathouse walls, the palace slept uneasily. The pyres outside the city smoldered to ash. Somewhere in the guest wing the boy dreamed. The transport to Coruscant lifted from Naboo beneath a sky scrubbed pale by the passing rain. Anakin stood at the viewport until the planet had become only a marbled sphere suspended in black. He had looked at Tatooine that way once too, his face reflected ghost-like in glass, the world of his birth shrinking behind him while every part of his body insisted home was still close enough to run back to. Naboo was different. He had not belonged there when he arrived and did not belong there now as he left. Yet something of him remained among its lakes and palace halls nonetheless. The echo of a promise, the memory of fire on water, the face in the steam below the city. Yoda traveled on the same vessel but did not seek the boy out during the journey. That absence pained Anakin more than open rejection might have. Children understand attention. They are less equipped for careful silence. Padme came to speak with him once before the ship made the jump, bringing a small packet of Naboo sweets he was too heartsore to eat, and a mechanical bracelet one of the palace technicians had found in a supply locker. "You left your toolkit in the hangar," she said. He took the bracelet and turned it over in his hands. It was ordinary, scratched, useful. Exactly the sort of object adults forgot children valued because it had no ceremonial importance. "Thank you. You repaired half our systems while everyone else was too busy panicking to find the right wrench. The least Naboo can do is return your things." "Oh." He almost smiled. "Almost. Will I see you again?" he asked. She should have given a diplomatic answer. "The galaxy is small. Our paths may cross. Naboo will always remember you." Instead, because she was tired and he was honest and the moment permitted nothing false, she said, "Yes, I think so." He nodded as though the certainty mattered more than the reason. Coruscant met them with its usual refusal to admit that any single tragedy anywhere else in the galaxy could possibly merit stillness. It was all light and speed and layers, towers thrusting through cloud, traffic rivers braided in every direction, a world that had forgotten the horizon in favor of endless vertical appetite. Anakin pressed against the shuttle window as the city planet rose to meet them. Wonder tried to push through grief and could not entirely fail. Was the difficult thing about being young. The world kept insisting on marvel, even when the heart wanted only permission to ache. The Jedi Temple stood apart from the rest of Coruscant not by distance, but by intention. Its clean lines and high terraces seemed almost severe after Naboo's decorative grace. It was not built to charm. It was built to endure the idea of itself. When Anakin stepped out onto the landing platform, bag in hand, the air smelled not of lake water and damp leaves, but of stone warmed by machinery, faint incense, and the impersonal breath of a metropolis too large to know his name. Temple attendants came to take him below. Not one of them was unkind. That was part of what hurt. Kindness inside a system often felt colder than love. He was given guest quarters first, then a schedule, then robes suitable for preliminary instruction if instruction was to occur. He met children younger than himself who moved through the halls with ease born of repetition. Some smiled shyly. Others stared at the desert boy from a war zone as children in institutions always stare at the newcomer who arrives carrying rumor. Anakin gave back what smile he could and found that his face did not remember the shape. The council considered him that same day. He was not present for their full debate, but walls and old temples carried tone if not words, and fragments reached him afterward through attendant whispers and the altered expressions of those who came and went from the chamber. Mace argued against immediate apprenticeship. Several masters agreed. The boy was too old, too attached, too recently wounded by events no child should have had to absorb. Yoda did not deny any of it. Yet he refused to let the matter close around a simple no-do-be. "The Sith are returned," one master said. "Would you place prophecy and instability in the same room and call it wisdom?" "Already in the same galaxy they are," Yoda replied. By evening, a compromise emerged. Anakin would remain at the temple under direct institutional supervision. He would be accepted into instruction as an initiate for observation, discipline, and preliminary training, but not taken immediately as anyone's Padawan. No vows beyond those already implicit in residence. No field assignments. No final commitment from the council. A waiting room dressed as mercy. Anakin heard the decision from Yoda himself in a chamber lined with tall windows. The old master spoke gently. That made the words no easier. "So I'm staying," Anakin said. "For now. And nobody wants to teach me." Yoda's ears tilted. "Someone to teach you. Others fear what teaching may awaken. That doesn't even make sense. Often, fear does not." Anakin looked out over Coruscant's impossible spread of towers. Somewhere far below, traffic moved in endless shining lanes like blood through veins. "Kwai Gon said I was meant to be a Jedi." Yoda's face changed just enough to register the name. Kwai Gon believed many things others did not. Sometimes right, he was. Sometimes not. Anakin's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer either." "No." Yoda stood with both hands folded in his sleeves. "But true it is." Later that same night, in a secure office deep within the Senate complex, Palpatine received his first formal brief as Chancellor, while appearing to read it with perfect concentration, and actually devoting a portion of his mind elsewhere entirely. The public machinery of office pleased him. Petitioners, committee assignments, ceremonial language, threats disguised as compromise. It all moved with the predictable vanity of institutions convinced they were unique in history. He dismissed his aides at last and remained alone in a room of red drapery, gold trim, and shadowed glass. A small signal flashed across a private channel, keyed to Naboo frequencies older than the current constitution. "Below the Palace of Theed," Maul answered. Their communication was brief. 2 Federation accounts terminated. 1 surviving logistics officer removed. Restricted customs records recovered and burned. 3 substructure routes mapped. 2 still incomplete Gungan patrols in the marsh exits. No sighting of the Queen. No attempt against Panaka, though the captain's search grid had narrowed around the old maintenance spine. Sidious approved, corrected, redirected. His voice never lost the mild cadence the Senate would soon mistake for benevolence. "Do not spend yourself on soldiers," he said. "Their deaths make noise. I require it. He will keep searching." "Good." There was a pause. Then Sidious added, as though mentioning a footnote of little significance, "The boy remains in the temple." Maul understood that the remark was meant to seem casual. That made it less casual. As an initiate. Provisionally. The apprentice said nothing. Sidious's unseen mouth likely curved. Learn patience from this, if nothing else. When the signal ended, Maul moved through a newly claimed chamber beneath Naboo that had once belonged to an earlier dynasty's utility priests, keepers of groundwater levels and ceremonial infrastructure, long since rendered obsolete by modern engineering. The room had stone walls laced with roots from gardens above, and bronze mechanisms now dead but still ornate with river motifs. He had turned it into a base with ruthless efficiency. Rations, med gel dotty, spare robes, weapons kit, a table spread with stolen maps and route markers made from cut wire. Above him, a world rebuilt its confidence. On Corasont, a boy unpacked a tool bracelet into a guest drawer and tried not to cry over the wrongness of silence in a room that held no desert wind, no mother's footsteps, no promise of a master returning in the morning. That first night in the temple, Anakin dreamed of Naboo again. Not the lakes, not Padme's smile, not the starfighter or the cheers in the hangar. He dreamed the palace foundations were endless, and every corridor curved back toward the same chamber where a red blade lit steam from within, like a wound trying to remember it, was also light. He woke before dawn with the certainty that the thing beneath Naboo had not been left behind. At breakfast he said nothing. Across the galaxy, Maul set a fresh route marker into the map of the Queen's world and began making Naboo's hidden places his own. Peace, when it returned to Naboo, came dressed carefully. Gardens were replanted first. Naboo had always believed beauty was not decoration but order made visible, and so flower beds devastated by tracked armor were renewed before some outlying roads were fully repaired. Musicians returned to public squares. Schools reopened. The fountains in Theed ran longer each evening. Committees were formed. Reparations discussed. Prisoners catalogued. Portraitists began work on commemorative canvases in which the battle would already be acquiring the flattering shape history preferred. Bravery, unity, sacrifice, deliverance. Only a few people knew how false that shape remained. Panaka slept in 2-hour increments and developed the habit of reading substructure reports over midnight meals gone cold at his desk. The phantom in the foundations had not struck again in open proximity to the palace staff after the tunnel ambush, but traces of him surfaced in ways that kept pressure on the nerves of every officer in Naboo's service. An unauthorized relay found burned out in a dry culvert north of Theed. A warehouse clerk in the river district vanished, later discovered in the shell of an old turbine chamber with his access codes missing. 2 customs ledgers entered into evidence after the occupation turned out, upon review, to have sections cleanly excised by heat precise enough to suggest neither accident nor crude sabotage. Panaka learned to read absence as well as presence. That was the assassin's true language. Not chaos. Removal. Padme, still dividing her days between Naboo governance and the widening demands of the Republic, received every report marked for her eyes. Some she read alone. Others she made Panaka summarize because the written details invited too much imagination. At night in her Coruscant apartments, with Senate traffic gleaming below and aides finally gone, she would sit by the glass and feel the same cold line of thought return. Victory had rescued her world, but not cleansed it. One evening, she looked up from a secured dispatch and said, "If this becomes public, the Federation's allies will say Naboo invents ghosts to justify greater military support." Panaka stood near the door, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man who had forgotten how to relax them. "Then the Federation's allies can spend one night under the palace." She almost smiled. "You should have gone into diplomacy." "I considered it until my conscience improved." The exchange eased nothing. Still, it kept despair from becoming ceremony. Below Theed, Maul expanded. He learned the city not as residents knew it, by avenues and palaces and districts of occupation and privilege, but by pressure valves, water veins, forgotten dynastic passages, culverts running toward the lake country, silted boat tunnels once used for royal escape, and crypt-adjacent service corridors abandoned when Naboo ceased burying its nobles beneath the terraces. He moved through them with increasing confidence, a dark geometry threading beneath public order. What Sidious had said proved true. A restored world made an excellent hiding place. Citizens wanted to believe in peace. Their wanting did half the work for him. Sometimes he surfaced at the edges of night in a heavy cloak and walked the outer gardens where statues cast longer shadows than guards anticipated. Once he crossed an old bridge just before dawn and watched gardeners kneel to reset flowers around a monument to some queen from centuries earlier. Their concentration on petals and symmetry disgusted him. It also taught him more about Naboo than any official archive could have. These people would ignore subterranean dread for as long as daylight gave them something lovely enough to tend. Maul's base shifted 3 times in as many weeks. He preferred movement. He established caches in the old priest's chamber, the root-bound crypt passage beneath a memorial court, and a half-flooded transit spur that opened toward reeds outside the city walls. Every move made Panaka's maps worse. Every mapped route made Sidious's future stronger. On Corasont, Anakin discovered that the temple's peace had rules. Rise before dawn, meditation before food, forms before questions. Questions before certainty if the question was the right kind, and not at all if it was the wrong kind. He excelled at some things immediately. Mechanics workshops adored him. He could take apart a damaged training remote twice as fast as boys who had grown up with far finer tools. He felt the flows of circuitry the way other children felt melody. In lights training, he moved too quickly and with too much instinct, but even the masters who frowned at his aggression noticed the speed. Meditation was another matter. Stillness inside the temple was not the same as stillness on Tatooine or Naboo. In the desert, silence had always contained wind, sand, distant engines, his mother humming over repairs. On Naboo, silence had carried water and morning bells, and the sense of something alive beneath stone. In the temple, silence had architecture. It was deliberate, collective, almost impersonal. Anakin sat among the other initiates with his legs crossed and his palms open and found that every instruction to release attachment only made his thoughts grip harder. His mother's hands, Kwai Gon's voice, Padme turning in black beside the pyres, red eyes above a steam-wet grate. Let the thought pass, one instructor told him. How? He asked. Do not cling to it. That's just saying it again. The class tittered. The instructor sighed. Anakin glared at the floor and wished, not for the first time, that Obi-Wan had lived long enough to become the teacher he had seemed almost destined to become. Even his resistance might have been easier to fight against than this careful institutional distance. Word of the boy's difficulties traveled quickly through the temple. So did word of his gifts. Palpatine made certain he heard both. The first invitation came under harmless pretext. A message from the Chancellor's office requesting that the hero of Naboo's star battle visit for a brief commendation and personal thanks. No one in the temple could easily object. Public gratitude cost nothing. Yoda did not approve, but neither did he forbid. Mace disapproved more visibly, which only increased Anakin's strange, guilty pleasure at being wanted somewhere. Palpatine received him in a private office not yet fully reorganized after the transition of power. Half-packed crates sat near one wall. New insignia hung beside old drapery. The room smelled of expensive paper, warm light, and faint medicinal herbs. It felt, to Anakin, astonishingly unlike the temple. Softer, warmer, human. There he is, Palpatine said, rising with apparent delight. Naboo's impossible pilot. Anakin ducked his head, suddenly shy. I just got lucky. Palpatine gestured him to a seat and sat opposite rather than behind the larger formal desk. A move so minor and so expertly judged that even many adults would not have recognized it as strategy. Luck often prefers the prepared. No master in the temple spoke that way. Masters praised discipline, restraint, surrender. Palpatine praised capacity. He asked after Anakin's studies, listened attentively to the answers, asked whether Coruscant still felt strange, whether the temple food was edible, whether the other children were kind, whether Naboo returned to him in dreams. The last question stilled Anakin. Sometimes, he admitted, "The dead do that," Palpatine said softly. "They continue speaking through the shape they leave in us." Anakin stared at him. It was the kind of sentence he had needed a Jedi to say, and no Jedi had said. Not because they lacked compassion, perhaps, but because their compassion was trained to move away from attachment, while his grief kept moving straight through it. "I keep thinking," he said before he meant to, "that if I was faster or better or if I'd gone down there sooner." "You are a child," Palpatine said, and made the words sound like an accusation against the universe, rather than against the boy. "You are not responsible for the crimes of monsters." Something in Anakin loosened. Not healed. Merely loosened. Back on Naboo, Maul listened from a hidden relay to fragments of public addresses Palpatine delivered in the Senate. Restoration, unity, vigilance, cooperation between systems. Every phrase ran on 2 tracks at once, one audible and one real. Maul respected that. He also came to understand, with slow, unwelcome clarity, that Sidious power did not lie only in command. It lay in how completely he inhabited each mask while never mistaking a mask for a face. That understanding sharpened Maul's obedience and unsettled it in the same motion. The first rumor of a horned phantom reached Padme from the Lake Country 6 weeks after the battle. A ferryman swore he had seen red light under the old South Bridge after midnight. 2 children in the Reed villages refused to go near an abandoned sluice tunnel because the fireman lived there. A shrine caretaker reported footprints on stone where there should have been only standing water. Panaka dismissed most of it publicly and logged all of it privately. Fear bred nonsense. Nonsense often hid data. Naboo went on flowering. Anakin went on struggling. And in the spaces between public peace and private dread, Sidious went on planting both. The next strike came because Panaka finally got close enough to be useful. For weeks, the pattern had resisted pattern. A missing clerk here. A sabotaged ledger there. A supply cache burned before it could be cataloged. But then an archivist in the customs quarter remembered, under the pressure of proper questioning, that several pre-occupation records tied to restricted royal waterways had been requested under false authority during the blockade. Panaka pulled the files. Most were ruined by targeted heat damage. One fragment remained intact long enough to indicate a storage vault beneath the eastern embankment, sealed since the reign of Varuna and never updated in modern security maps, because no one believed it mattered anymore. Panaka believed in old things the moment he learned assassins preferred them. The Jedi Council, informed through secured channels, dispatched investigators at once. They did not send Mace or Yoda. Such masters could not be spared to every whisper in the Republic's newly darkened corners. Instead, they sent 2 knights, one older, deliberate, a man whose years had softened neither his reflexes nor his caution. The other younger, a woman with quick eyes and the particular alertness of someone already aware that this mission might become the story against which the rest of her life was measured. Panaka met them at dusk in the lower embankment access house, with 6 of his best guards and no optimism worth naming. The older Jedi studied the map fragment under lamplight. If this passage was used during the occupation, the assassin may already have emptied it. "Then we confirm an absence," Panaka said. "And if he hasn't?" Panaka checked the charge on his compact rifle. "Then I'd appreciate it if the Order does what the Order is for." The younger knight almost smiled. "I was beginning to think you disliked us." Panaka glanced at her. "I dislike being late." They descended after nightfall. The access stair spiraled through damp stone that predated most of Theed above it. Torches were used instead of electric lamps after the first landing because the vault's lower systems refused modern power without triggering noise on half the old grid. The air cooled as they went. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. At intervals, carved angels emerged from the walls, not celestial in the galactic sense but Naboo's old guardian figures with folded hands and blank faces worn by time. Their serenity made the descent feel like trespass. Panaka hated serenity. At the first landing, the younger Jedi crouched and touched 2 fingers to the floor. "Recent traffic," she said. Panika saw only damp stone and a smear that might have been dirt. Jedi saw more than dirt. It was one reason ordinary men resented and relied on them simultaneously. They continued. Above them, hidden on the broken upper arch of the burial vault, Maul waited. He had known about the Eastern Passage for days. Panaka's archivist had talked because Maul had permitted him to talk, placing fear in one place so attention would move away from 3 others. The surviving file fragment had survived because Maul had left it that way. This was not carelessness. It was architecture. Sidious wanted uncertainty to spread. Uncertainty required occasional blood. Maul lay still enough to let dust settle on his sleeves. The vault below had once housed funerary barges used when Naboo's monarchs were still committed to elaborate river-bound rites. Now the chamber was empty except for drained channels, stone plinths, and the remains of iron hooks from systems long dismantled. The broken arch above the central floor gave him angle, concealment, and first strike. He had studied the Jedi route from the moment they entered the stair. The older knight sensed something wrong 3 steps before the ambush. He stopped, head turning, blue saber already coming alive in his hand with a flash that cast the chamber in cold living light. Hold! Panika's guards halted immediately. The younger Jedi ignited her own blade. Blue met blue across wet stone and old carvings, and for one brief instant the vault looked not haunted but sanctified. Then Maul fell through that illusion like an execution. He dropped from the arch without a sound. His double blade came alive in midair, red spilling over the chamber walls in a violent wash that turned the angels monstrous. He landed not on the Jedi but between them and Panaka's men, a tactical wedge driven into the center of their formation before ordinary reflex could recover from surprise. The first exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Red struck blue, reversed, split, came low, went high. The older knight absorbed the opening assault and nearly lost his left arm anyway. The younger stepped sideways to flank and found Maul already turning, one blade locking hers while the other snapped backward toward the older master's throat. Panaka fired around the edge of the duel and hit only stone. Sparks burst from a funerary hook and rained into the drained channel. "Fall back!" one guard shouted. "No," Panaka snarled, because retreat turned tunnels into killing lanes. The vault became a storm of reflected color. Maul fought with the same economical ferocity Panaka had seen in the tunnels, but here, forced into direct contest with trained Jedi, the full design of his style emerged. There was nothing ornamental in it. No flourish for admiration. Every spin opened an angle. Every feint contained a kill. He used the length of his weapon like an argument against balance itself, keeping both knights working at ranges they would rather not allow. The older one adjusted first, stepping inside one arc and nearly scoring Maul's side. The Sith twisted, took the burn across already scarred flesh, and punished the proximity with an elbow strike that cracked the man's jaw hard enough to stagger him. The younger knight lunged to cover. Maul met her blade, locked it for the briefest fraction, and looked directly into her eyes. She saw then what Panaka had already begun to understand. This was not rage made clumsy. This was hate trained until it became almost serene. He broke the lock low, rotated and drove the opposite blade through her shoulder and into the wall behind with such force that stone spat fragments into the air. She cried out, not in panic, but in fury. The older knight came in again, blue blade slashing downward, and Maul tore his weapon free just in time to catch it. The impact shook the chamber. Panaka's guards surged forward as one, abandoning any illusion of perfect line in favor of concentrated chaos. 2 fired. One died before his second shot left the barrel. Maul severed the rifle, stepped through the falling halves, and cut the man across the chest in a single ruthless continuation of movement. Panaka got close enough to smell ozone and wet stone. He fired point blank. The bolt glanced off a red blade and exploded against an angel's face, taking half the carving with it. The older knight shouted to the younger, "Now!" She dropped under Maul's turning blade despite the wound to her shoulder, cutting not for his body but for the floor beneath his lead foot. The stone split. For the first time, the Sith's balance broke. It was only a fraction. Against ordinary fighters, it would have meant nothing. Against Jedi, it nearly ended him. The older knight drove forward with both hands on his saber, blue light aimed straight through Maul's chest. Maul abandoned position rather than pride. He hurled himself backward into the drained channel, rolled through old silt and shallow water, and came up beneath a rain of blaster fire from Panaka's remaining guards. A bolt scored his thigh. Another burned past his ear. He leapt to the side wall, ran 2 impossible steps along stone, and vaulted back to the broken arch in a red blur. The younger knight tried to pursue and nearly collapsed. The wound through her shoulder had gone deep. The older master caught her with one arm without lowering his blade. "Seal the upper exits," Panaka yelled. Too late. Maul severed a rusted chain above the central vault as he retreated. The remaining funerary counterweight, unused for generations, dropped with catastrophic force into the chamber floor. Stone erupted. The impact shattered a section of the old drainage channel and sent black water surging upward in a foul burst. Guards were thrown back. Torches died. For 3 chaotic seconds, the vault belonged to falling debris, steam, and darkness. When light returned, Maul was gone. Only the dead proved he had been there at all. One guard lay near the stair with a blade mark so clean it seemed indecent. Another bled out in Panaka's arms before medics could reach the lower landing. The younger Jedi still breathed, pale and furious, while the older knight knelt beside her with one hand pressed to the wound, and the other holding his saber ready out of sheer refusal to admit the fight had ended. Panaka stood in the wrecked vault, chest heaving, and looked up at the broken arch where the Sith had waited for them. Dust drifted through blue and red burn marks. Water pooled over carved stone angels now split and blackened. The assassin had baited them, measured them, killed in front of them, and vanished again into a city Panaka had sworn to make safe. On Corasont, at the exact moment the counterweight struck and the force rippled through the chamber, Anakin woke with a shout. He sat bolt upright in the temple dormitory, breath tearing at his throat, every muscle locked. Around him the other initiates stirred and murmured. A caretaker came hurrying in. Anakin heard none of it clearly. He had been in the vault, not in body, in something stranger and worse. He had felt water and old stone, and the bright, cold fear of someone he did not know facing the red blade in close quarters. He had felt the satisfaction that followed the kill, not as a human emotion, but as a sharpening. Yoda, in meditation elsewhere in the temple, opened his eyes before the caretaker's message reached him. The disturbance was brief. Its meaning was not. By morning, the council knew Naboo's phantom was no rumor, and Panaka knew the shadow beneath his world was growing bolder. After the vault ambush, Naboo ceased pretending its hidden war might remain hidden forever. Publicly, nothing changed. Markets opened. Restoration projects advanced. Speeches continued. Theed's terraces filled with light each evening. But security checkpoints multiplied near old infrastructure. Panaka's officers began sealing sections of the city under the pretext of structural repair. Rumors spread faster precisely because officials denied them. A phantom below the palace. A demon in the culverts. A surviving Federation experiment. A fallen Jedi. Naboo's talent for beauty did not exclude superstition. It merely dressed superstition in finer language. Padme read the report of the vault fight alone. She did so at a late hour in her Coruscant apartments, while the Senate district glowed beyond the glass like a jeweled machine incapable of shame. The document was clinical because Panaka had forced himself to make it so. 2 guards dead. 1 Jedi Knight gravely wounded. Assassin confirmed with high confidence to be identical to palace combatant, observed during liberation. Subsurface route network assessed as significantly more extensive than previously recorded. Additional recommendations appended. She read it twice, then set it aside and pressed her fingers to her eyes until color burst there. The Republic had given her world congratulations. What it had not given was certainty. Naboo had helped elevate a chancellor and restore an army of applause to the Senate's own image of itself. Meanwhile, something murderous still walked beneath her people's feet. Padme lowered her hands and stared at the lights of Coruscant until they blurred. She did not yet suspect how intimately those lights were tied to the dark under Naboo. But for the first time she wondered whether victory had opened a door rather than closed one. In the temple, Yoda spoke with the council behind closed doors, and said little that comforted anyone. "The shadow remains on Naboo," one master said. "Should we not commit more resources?" "Commit, yes," Yoda replied, "but blind not be. A blade below the palace is only a blade. The hand above it, more dangerous." Mace stood near the central window, hands in sleeves, face carved by unease. The boy felt the ambush. Several heads turned. Even masters who mistrusted prophecy could not ignore practical anomalies forever. "A nightmare proves nothing," another said. "No," Mace answered, "but a pattern proves something." Anakin was not invited into this conversation. He stood instead at a tall window in one of the temple's quieter halls, and looked out over Coruscant's sleepless expanse. Rain moved in distant silver sheets between towers. Air traffic stitched red and white lines through the dark. The city seemed permanent in the way children often mistake great machines for permanence. Yet after Naboo he no longer believed scale protected anything. Palpatine had spoken with him again that afternoon. Not for long. Just enough to ask whether temple life still felt confining. Just enough to observe, with gentle sympathy, that many great gifts were first treated as inconveniences by those too bound to rules to recognize them. Just enough to leave Anakin with the dangerous comfort of being understood by someone who asked nothing immediate in return. He thought now of that kindness and of Yoda's caution and could not make them fit together. He thought of his mother on Tatooine and felt guilt so sharp it seemed almost physical. He thought of Kwai Gon and the promise that had changed hands and perhaps been dropped. He thought of the horned face in steam and of the impossible certainty that whatever path his life had opened onto, that face waited somewhere along it. Far beneath Theed, in a chamber whose cracked ceiling admitted thin lines of rainwater from the roots above, Maul knelt before Sidious's hologram. The blue figure hovered above an old basalt altar once used for ceremonial water readings under Naboo's first dynasties. Rain dripped from root to stone in slow, regular taps. Around the chamber, Maul had spread new maps weighted at the corners with pieces of broken angel statuary recovered from the vault. He had cleaned the wound in his thigh, bound it, ignored it. The ache sharpened rather than impeded him. Pain remained useful. "You escalated," Sidious said. Maul kept his head slightly bowed. "Panika escalated." "And you answered?" "Yes." The hologram's light threw cold edges over Maul's tattoos. "One wounded Jedi, 2 dead guards, increased scrutiny. Was this your intention?" "It is now." Sidious was silent long enough for water to strike stone 6 times. At last he said, "Perhaps?" The almost approval was more unsettling than criticism would have been. Sidious rarely allowed uncertainty into his voice unless uncertainty itself served him. "The Order will commit more attention," Maul said. "They will commit the wrong kind. Institutions answer fear with process. By the time process reaches understanding, new conditions exist." Sidious leaned slightly forward within the blue light. The boy felt the attack. Maul lifted his eyes a fraction. "Then the connection strengthens. Perhaps." Again that word. Measured. Considering. Dangerous. For the first time, Maul let the question come closer to speech. "What is he to you?" The chamber held still. Rain.y. Roots. Old stone. Blue light. When Sidious answered, his tone was mild enough to make the answer more terrible. "Potential." Maul absorbed it and felt the answer settle where older obedience had once rested undisturbed. Potential. Not apprentice. Not heir. A term broad enough to mean anything and so broad enough to threaten everything. "I killed the Jedi," Maul said. "Yes. I remain hidden while you court a child." Sidious's gaze hardened almost imperceptibly. "You remain useful while I shape an age." The rebuke should have struck him to silence. Instead, it clarified. Maul understood then with cutting simplicity that survival had not changed the nature of his place. He was still what he had always been to Sidious. Edge, instrument, fear, made mobile. He might be a sharpened instrument, a prized one, even a beloved one in the narrow way tyrants may love effectiveness. But he was not the design itself. That realization might have broken a weaker being. In Maul, it became something else. He bowed lower. As you command. Sidious watched him. Whatever else the master possessed, he possessed an exquisite sensitivity to the inner motion of other creatures. He heard lies by what they lacked. He sensed rebellion first as a change in the texture of obedience. But Maul's discipline still held. Whatever new thing had been born in him, it had not yet learned speech. Continue, Sidious said. Naboo is a seed world now. Beautiful, wounded, grateful. The Senate looks to it and sees resilience. The Jedi look to it and see unfinished darkness. Both are useful perceptions. Maintain the wound. Do not let it close. The hologram vanished. Maul remained kneeling after the light had gone, staring at the rainwater collecting in the cracks of the old altar stone. Maintain the wound. Naboo as instrument. The boy as potential. Himself as edge. All of it true. None of it complete. At last he rose. He moved through the chamber and placed a hand on the map of Theed, over the palace complex and the lake channels branching outward like veins. Above this very spot courtiers slept, guards changed shifts, gardeners planned morning work, and ordinary people believed themselves sheltered by the same walls whose foundations he now possessed better than any steward or engineer. He had killed 2 Jedi in open duel. He had drawn blood from the Order again in the vault. He had survived where the galaxy believed him ash or rumor. Beneath humiliation and utility, beneath the old discipline that still formed the skeleton of his thought, another conviction began to take shape. If he was to remain in shadow, then the shadow would be his. On Corasont, Anakin kept his place at the window until the traffic lanes below blurred into abstract light. He did not know what future had been spoken over him in rooms he was not allowed to enter. He knew only that he stood between wants no one had taught him how to reconcile. To be chosen. To be free. To be strong enough that no promise could be taken from him by death or doubt. To find the thing under Naboo and make it answer for what it had done. Behind him, the temple halls lay quiet. Across the city, Padme stood at her own window and wondered how long a world could heal while hiding an infection in its bones. In the council chamber, Yoda sat in meditation beneath dimmed lights and felt the currents of the Force nodding where they should have flowed. And under the gracious palaces, gardens, and lakes of Naboo, Maul ignited his blade for no audience at all. Red light filled the hidden chamber, reflected in rainwater and broken stone, and the eyes of a being who had learned too young that power and belonging were never the same thing. He held the weapon level, listening to its old murderous song, and saw not the duel he had won but the longer war that victory had opened. Far away, in a city of towers that never truly surrendered to night, Anakin turned from the window with the same red afterimage burning behind his eyes, though he could not have said why. Between them stretched worlds, institutions, masters, queens, griefs, and schemes vast enough to reshape a republic. Beneath all of it, the same shadow moved.